Thank you for the introduction. Actually, it's not 40 years, it's 48 years. So I'm not going to try 50. I think 49 would be fine. Anyway, top of the morning to all of you. Why I'm using this Irish expression is that I read this morning very happy news. The Irish government has abolished a €3 air travel tax as from April. The news came this morning. And why am I interested of what's happening in Ireland? Well, I think anywhere in the world where a government realizes that these taxes are detrimental for our industry, it's a good sign, and other governments should really follow suit and do what the Irish did. And there are many governments who should do that. So anyway, good for the Irish. And also, I'd like to welcome all the overseas attendees here. Very welcome. You will find that the welcome is very warm here in Singapore. The Singaporeans are extremely hospitable people, and also the climate provides you with a lot of warmth. So enjoy that. I also like to thank Terrapin for inviting me again to this year's conference, and I will now have the opportunity to share some developments that are taking place within our industry. When I walked into this conference, I saw a planche of the low-cost conference coming up in February, and I thought about when was it that I was speaking at the low-cost conference at Terrapin? That was 2005 in London. So actually, this is not my first time I'm talking at these conferences, but the previous times were at low-cost conferences. So I know that I have a quite limited time to talk about things, and there would be a lot to talk about, so I have to try to kind of condense my message. But I'd like to start by being a little emotional. And at this age, you really become emotional about just about everything. But the reason this time is well justified, considering that I'm a passionate aviation veteran. And let me see, here we go. Well, this is the reason for being emotional. Our industry will only in 10 weeks' time from now be celebrating 100 years of commercial aviation. On 1st of January 1914, the first commercial flight was flown between St. Petersburg and Tampa, Florida. The distance of this route was 21 miles, and the time it took to conduct this first flight was 23 minutes. The aircraft are actually as you can see, it is a flying boat, flew at an altitude of 50 feet. Halfway to Tampa, the engine misfired. The pilot touched down in the bay, made some adjustments, and took off again. The price for the first flight was, was $400, which was the result of a bid at an auction. The ordinary fare then became $5, and that would be around $490 in today's money. The $400 paid for by the first passenger would be around $39,000 today. So this kind of proves the fact that the yields were much better 100 years ago, and unfortunately they've been declining ever since. Since the first commercial flight, only 10 years after the very first powered flight in Kitty Hawk, piloted by Orville Wright, commercial aviation has grown to unbelievable dimensions. The aviation industry supports now 57 million jobs worldwide and has a global economic impact of $2.2 trillion. This is, for example, double the size of the GDP of Indonesia and about $700 million more than the GDP of Australia. This is indeed a remarkable conclusion to incredible first 100 years of commercial aviation. Think about the astronomical impact of civil aviation to our world during these first 100 years. Without aviation, our world would look very different, and we would have much less of the international connectivity and and the interaction between people and businesses that we have experienced thanks to aviation. So all of us here today who are can be very proud for working for or with in an industry that has been such a great force for good during its first 100 years. And by the way, what is ahead of us is going to be even more incredible. I do not think that anyone could in their wildest imagination be able to predict correctly how our industry will be shaped after yet another 100 years, or even much less than that. I'm, however, sure that reality will be much more amazing than fiction. It usually is when it comes to aviation. Ron said before that I have been involved with the commercial space industry, and indeed I could see what's coming in the future. It's going to be incredible, but that's not the topic for today. So you will see when the time comes. So just 3 years from now, we will already be carrying 3.6 billion passengers in the world. That's 600 million more than today, this year, and about half of this big growth comes from Asia Pacific, and again, half of that from China alone. But our industry needs to be treated better by governments. We should not be considered as the source of income, but the generator of income for the economies of each country. We should also be treated like other businesses with a higher level of liberalization to enable us to grow in a profitable and sustainable way. Liberalization is a complicated word. It could mean so many different things. In general, within the aviation industry, it refers to the act of opening free access to the markets between and maybe even within countries. When the USA liberalized its aviation market in the late 70s and early 80s, it was a relatively simple process. It took place in one country, covered by the same legislation, regulation, and currency. The airlines were granted the freedom of being more in charge of conducting their business and their developments, just like so many other types of industries were allowed to do. The US aviation industry experienced quick growth through new routes and more frequencies on existing ones. The hub and spoke concept was created, the number of airlines grew rapidly, and new business models were introduced. Deregulated competition brought along innovation, low fares, and new benefits to the consumers. Eventually, the market forces took care of the increasing amount of deadwood, and the industry went through several phases of restructuring and consolidation. It was not always a smooth ride, due to many unexpected circumstances. There are fewer airlines today in the US than in the beginning of the deregulation. The airline industry in the US has worked its way through many difficulties and is in better shape now than it was then. Consumers have been the biggest beneficiaries of the deregulation, which was one of the main purposes of the deregulation to start with. Then came the European deregulation that took place in the early 90s, and in a more gradual way than in the US. The EU is not one country, but a tight union of 28 countries covering many areas of economic activity, with joint regulation and legislation side by side with national regulation and legislation. At the time of the European deregulation, the EU had just a few more member states than the ASEAN community has today. It would probably have been a more difficult thing to start deregulation with 28 countries than just, I think, 13 or 14 countries at that time. The European deregulation opened up opportunities for free access to all markets within the EU, including the right for an airline from one country to operate routes between any EU country, and even within, or between any EU countries, and even within another country's territory. It also removed barriers from airlines or investors from one country to acquire airlines or parts of airlines from other countries. In other words, the aviation industry had been liberated as far as access to markets and ownerships were concerned. One of the consequences of deregulation was the rapid introduction and growth of the low-cost sector that now represents about 50% of the volumes of the intra-European market. An interesting fact is, however, that the low-cost sector did not just take a bigger piece of the cake, but it also created a bigger cake. Lower fares and access to new destinations created new demand. And by the way, this is not now also happening in many parts of the world, and also including our part of the world, here in Asia Pacific. As in the USA, the market forces took care of pruning away the deadwood in Europe. Many well-known airline brands ceased to exist because they were not in the condition to survive in the new business environment. The beneficiaries were without a question the consumers and also the healthier part of the airline industry. Rather than having public policies supporting unhealthy airlines to stay alive through artificial respiration that distorts competition and fairness, it would be much better to have public policies that would help the airline industry to become healthier and more viable. This would be much better for the consumers, the aviation industry, and the economies of all countries. Aviation is the most international of businesses, which is the most international of all businesses, is not free at the global level to operate like other transnational industries. There are restrictions built into the current bilateral air services agreements in such areas as national ownership and control, access, capacity, frequency, and even pricing. These reduce the contributions of international aviation to trade, tourism, job creation, and economic growth. Imagine if other industries were subject to the same restrictions as the aviation industry, so that, for example, the governments of the United States and South Korea had to negotiate with each other over Apple's right to open a new store in Seoul. In return, South Korea might demand the Samsung to be permitted to open a retail outlet in New York, with a second city to be named in 2 years' time. Perhaps after months or even years of tedious back and forth negotiations, the two sides would settle that Apple could sell iPhones and iPads in Seoul, but not MacBooks, while Samsung could sell the Galaxy S3, but not the S4 in New York. What would be the impact on jobs and economic growth and entrepreneurship of this kind of regime, were it to be applied to globally to other commercial activities? So why does this have to apply to the airlines? IATA supports ICAO's leadership role in the area of liberalization and acknowledges the considerable ICAO policy and guidance material that has been developed in the areas of market access and foreign ownership and control. ICAO is the right forum to lead air transport to a more liberalized environment. Before a fully liberalized regime is in place, varying levels of regulation will inevitably exist around the world, creating substantial market distortions. IATA supports steps towards liberalization in such a manner that provides airlines with a fair and equal opportunity to compete in the global and regional markets. In this regard, governments should take transparent and effective measures in line with the prevailing ICAO guidance on fair competition. The experience of regions and countries that have liberalized demonstrate that liberalization can result in improved connectivity with corresponding benefits for the global economy and society. Once Malaysia and Thailand liberalized their bilateral air service agreement, the two countries saw a significant increase in passenger volumes, new jobs, and a contribution to the GDPs of these two countries. Improved connectivity brought about by aviation opens up new trade markets and encourages innovation, competition, and more choice. Aviation also provides significant social benefits, uniting people and facilitating cultural understanding as well as exchange of ideas. When it comes to the liberalization of the ASEAN aviation markets, and perhaps later on with more Asia-Pacific countries joining in, it is a very good thing that the ASEAN community has started this process. It is quite clear that the deregulation cannot take place with the same pace and the same way as it did in the USA and EU. But just because it is a more complicated project, it should not be allowed to move forward too slowly. More liberal bilateral agreements between the member countries are the first important step, and that has already started. We must recognize that the member states within the ASEAN community are at different levels of maturity when it comes to their aviation industry. Some countries like Singapore rely on aviation as one of its key strategic assets. Some others, like Myanmar, have just opened its markets to other countries on a much bigger scale and are therefore going through a transformation that will take some time and effort. We have also countries with a large population and long distances, like Indonesia, with great opportunities and also obligations to develop its domestic air transport services. Thanks to this significant diversity in many areas of economic and cultural activity, the liberalization of ASEAN will not reach the same level of intensity and scope as the deregulation in the USA and Europe. But if there's a will, there's a way. All the ASEAN member states should support each other in the liberalization process and iron out their differences. Liberalization is not an ideology, but solid and decisive action. During the process, it is important for the ASEAN member states to keep in mind the core principles of liberalization, some of which I have already mentioned early in my speech, in order to optimize the benefits of aviation to the consumers, the aviation industry, and the overall economies. Deviating from a fair and supportive path in the liberalization process will create wrong winners and losers for the wrong reasons. The purpose of free market access and the freedom to grow and prosper based on your own ability will also create winners and perhaps also some losers, but for the right reasons. The low-cost sector in Asia-Pacific has taken a fast-track approach to reap the benefits of liberalization through co-branding and other ways of finding new markets and expanding existing ones. Some established full-service carriers have also reached for the new markets by establishing low-cost subsidiaries. The ball is definitely rolling and cannot be stopped. When we talk about liberalization and deregulation, or the lack of it, we don't often talk about the flip side. The worst enemy of liberalization is complacency and resistance to change. The 38th ICAO Assembly that took place quite recently in Montreal introduced many changes that will make aviation safer, more secure, more efficient, and more sustainable, while at the same time give aviation the license to grow in a more fair and sensible political, regulatory, and business environment. In fact, the resolutions and agreements at the Assembly will give guidance to the 191 member states of ICAO to help their aviation industries to develop in a more sensible, more liberalized, and more integrated and harmonized way. A higher level of integration of commercial aviation is, in my opinion, an enabler of liberalization in the global village, including also our part of the world. I would like to share with you some of the key agreements at the Assembly that will directly affect our industry also here in Asia Pacific in a positive way. And these are very much about integration. Due to lack of time, I will not be able to cover in detail the agreements that relate to safety, security, and other technical or operational areas, but let me say this. IATA and our industry made several proposals in these areas, and all of them received strong support and acceptance by the ICAO Assembly. These changes will not only make it safer, better, and more efficient for the airlines to operate, but they will also save our industry billions of dollars. One of the biggest ticket items at the Assembly, and the one that will have a huge impact on our industry, is the climate change. This is a sensitive and tough topic, as the countries around the world have different options or opinions about how our industry should be accountable for its impact on our environment. The aviation industry is, in fact, the only industry, the global industry, so far that has taken the initiative to play its part and find a solution to reduce its emissions and become more sustainable. We have promised to become carbon neutral as from 2020. We will rely on a four-pillar strategy that includes improved technology, more efficient aircraft operations, infrastructure improvements, and a properly designed global market-based measures model. The last pillar, which is the market-based measures model, is the one that was discussed day in and day out at the Assembly. And finally, on the last day, an agreement was reached to establish a global market-based measures system for aviation during the next assembly 2016 and to implement it in 2020. This was a great victory for our industry. We will now have an opportunity to avoid a patchwork of various unfair and overlapping local and regional systems that would potentially become detrimental for our industry. Unfortunately, we have already noticed that the EU has some plans to deviate from what was agreed by the ICAO Assembly, but we have to wait and see what develops and hope that the EU will not jeopardize the great progress made at the Assembly by the majority of the member states. In order to emphasize the importance of a global solution, I'd like to say that the local and regional patchwork of highly regulated, unfair and unreasonable climate solutions will work against all common sense and prevent a level playing field for our industry as well as a higher level of liberalization. This kind of situation would be very bad for our passengers and our industry. In fact, it would be very bad for everybody, and it would definitely not solve the climate problem. So let us hope that all governments will, together with the aviation industry now, use the next 3 years to focus on creating a good and solid global mechanism that will indeed have a positive impact on the environment. Another topic that was that we proposed, the industry proposed at the Assembly, was about our concern for the inconsistency regarding the required passenger data and border control processes by various countries. Airlines are being burdened by a myriad of different types of requests for data, causing additional costs and headaches, and in many cases this data is not even being used, only collected. The Assembly showed support to our proposal to create standards, shared standards for this kind of data. And there are also two more topics worth mentioning. The first one deals with the ratification of the Montreal Convention 99. There are still some big countries in Asia Pacific that have not yet ratified this treaty, but I have been told that they are actually in the process of doing so. Until then, this is potentially also another temporary roadblock on the road towards the ASEAN liberalization. The ratification of MC99, which it is called, will provide shared standards for liability to our industry across nations, mitigating the confusion and complexity of multiple liability standards. It will also make it possible to use electronic documentation, which will enhance many processes regarding passenger handling and make it possible to implement e-freight and e-airway bills that again will improve the handling of freight and save costs. Closely related to this was our paper on consumer protection. Also in this area, we are trying to avoid patchwork of unfair, confusing and overlapping legislation when it comes to passengers traveling by air. The industry wants to have greater compatibility and convergence of different regimes and the development of core principles on consumer protection. Different types and levels of consumer protection within the ASEAN community would also be a pebble in the shoe when it comes to the smooth liberalization process. As I said before, I'm very pleased to report to you that all the industry proposals to the 191 member countries of the ICAO Assembly received a lot of support and approval. And this is a great news, as it gives us a good platform to keep building our industry for the future. The agreements at the ICAO Assembly will also promote a more liberal and less regulated aviation industry that will continue to be a force for good in our more and more connected world. The Asia-Pacific region and the ASEAN community will play an important role to drive changes for the aviation industry by enabling the seamless Asian skies to become reality. Also by joining the global community implementing a global climate solution for our industry, and by opening up the aviation markets in order to give businesses and traveling public more options at lower cost, and last but not least, by applying the best shared standards for safety, security, and other important operational areas. These thoughts conclude my presentation today. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and all the best when we start the next century of commercial aviation in January. Thank you.